Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. As I say most weeks, but it bears repetition, thanks to you, the TNT Show and Indie Live are delivering more exciting shows than ever. You can watch the TNT Show, for example, at indielive.net. It's streamed out on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Apparently, we're quite a hit on TikTok. Plus, on YouTube, you can view all the previous 150 odd shows. I mean, what's not to like, as they say. Also, as I say every week, but again, it's worth repetition, if you're upset by all the media coverage of political events, and dare I say it, health events most recently, where journalism is often junked in favour of stenography and or rehashed news releases, if you're looking for an alternative voice, well, you found it. We're here for you. Now is your chance to be here for us. Check out the crowdfunder. Kevin Gibney, who's our producer, does an absolutely monumental job. And my strong suggestion is that whatever you can do support him financially would be very, very worthwhile. Well, you know, it's been another great day for British democracy. Renowned health expert Professor Sridhar reveals that she received death threats and racist and misogynist abuse for her work to keep Scots safe during COVID. Some charmers out there. To balance that, I'd like to just comment from Ian Banks, the wonderful Ian Banks of sci-fi and novel writing fame. He said, you see the amount, listen to this, bear in mind that Ian has sadly not been with us for a number of years. This is what he said way back then. He said, you see the amount of Europhobia in England and you wonder, why would you want to stay? The Scots would make quite good Europeans, and it would be better to hitch ourselves to that star than deal with the morass that England might very well descend into. How prescient Ian Banks was way back then. Tonight, we'll be talking to another excellent guest, Jamie Hepburn, who's Minister for Independence. Among the subjects we'll be covering tonight are the steps to independence and his work in the Scottish Government. He'll also be taking your questions live, so there's still time to get your question considered. You'll see the details on the screen. We've received a whole bunch of emails. Thank you for all of those. We'll try and get through as many of these questions as we can. As you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Now, to our guest tonight, Jamie Hepburn. Thanks for joining us, Jamie. How are you? How are you, Jamie? Oh, we seem to be having a technical glitch here. Kevin, can you help?
I'm very well, John. Thank you for having me on.
Well done. Well, I thought we'd lost you there.
Very well. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly. Absolutely perfectly. Jamie,
I can hear you, John. I'm very well.
I'd love to ask you how you feel about what comments you might have about this opinion poll in the National, which suggests that nearly 6 out of 10 Scots agree or strongly agree with the proposal that the powers to negotiate and legislate for independence should be at Holyrood, not anywhere else. What do you think?
Well, indeed, yeah, and that's not a surprise, irrespective of, I think, a person's view on the overall constitutional question. I think we've seen, virtually since the establishment of devolution, a consistently strong support for the Scottish Parliament being the primary focus of political activity, political life in Scotland. So it's no surprise to me that that's the outcome of that poll.
I mean, what steps do you think the Scottish Government should take to create that power in Scotland, i.e. to, as it were, in the mind of some people, repatriate that power to hold a referendum to Holyrood?
Well, this is the difficult position we find ourselves in, of course, John. The SNP stood on an explicit platform in 2021, saying that if we were able to, if we secured support of people of Scotland, we should be able to have another referendum. And of course, people of Scotland endorsed that proposition. We have a mandate to have a referendum. Unfortunately, the reality of the British Constitution is such that political power largely still resides in the hands of the UK Parliament, UK government. So this remains a political matter, and of course this is going to be an election year, and once again we have to return to the ballot box. We've laid out what we'll say at that forthcoming election, seeking support from the people of Scotland to engage directly with the UK government so we can move towards independence.
Yeah. So you would welcome the powers being resided at Holyrood to have a plebiscite?
Well, I believe in independence, John, so I believe all the powers should be vested in the Scottish Parliament. But short of independence, of course, yes, ultimately I think it should be the Scottish Parliament that is able to determine whether or not that question of us having a referendum can be resolved there.
Let me ask you a very basic question. Do you believe the Scots are sovereign? The Scottish people are sovereign?
Yes, fundamentally. Fundamentally, I do. I suppose the problem we have is that trying to put that into practical reality, it comes up against the British Constitution, which of course we know is vested in the concept of Westminster sovereignty. Now, we could look back over the course of our constitutional history, but that's the reality we sadly come up against, and that's the reality we're trying to break free from.
So we effectively, we've got two sovereign entities as far as Scotland is concerned. There's the Scottish people who you believe are sovereign, and we've got Westminster, which insists that it's sovereign. Now, only one of these can be sovereign by definition. That's what sovereign means. It means the top position. So do you think it's the parliamentary sovereignty should precede or overwhelm the sovereignty of the Scottish people?
Well, fundamentally, I believe in the sovereignty of the Scottish people, but this is actually what independence is all about. It's trying to put that into practical effect. Now, we wanted to have a referendum, last year to be able to put that question to the people. That would be sovereignty in action. That would be placing power into the people's hands. But the Supreme Court ruled that we don't have the legislative competence in the Scottish Parliament to be able to unilaterally legislate for a referendum. And that seems to be the constitutional reality that we find ourselves in. So I suppose it's a question of what I fundamentally believe in, what should I believe should be the case. And I believe that the people of Scotland should be sovereign, and that independence is the way to achieve that.
Yeah. So I want to put a proposition to you that came in on an email. It was from a councillor. He was saying, why don't we do the following to resolve this logjam, if you like, because theoretically you've claimed, and many people watching tonight would agree with you, that the Scottish people are sovereign, but there's this entity somewhere else saying, well, no, we don't recognise your sovereignty, and we insist that you recognise our sovereignty. And this is what's been proposed. Look, please give me your reaction to this. It's a route to independence that's been suggested, that the SNP holds talks with leaders of all pro-independence parties and movements to reform the Yes Scotland entity. 2, that the SNP call a Holyrood election before the general election, and the voting strategy of SNP 1, Yes Scotland 2, and any supermajority would result in a declaration of independence. Wouldn't that solve the logjam?
Well, I think it's an illegitimate perspective. I suppose I would offer 2 reflections. First, we have an electoral opportunity come up. There is going to be a general election this year. We know that with certainty, and we need to be prepared for that. That's what we're headed into. The SNP had its conference and debated its strategy for the forthcoming election at its last conference. We've set out a very clear proposition. Line 1, page 1 of our manifesto will be a vote for the SNP is a vote for Scotland to become an independent country. I don't think we could be much clearer in that regard. And if we win a majority of the seats, we'll seek to put that into effect. Now, this other question of is there another path, and could we somehow dissolve Holyrood early and then seek to have a Scottish Parliament election? It could technically be possible. It isn't as straightforward as just doing it the same way that the UK Parliament is dissolved, of course. You know, the First Minister couldn't just go to His Majesty the King and say, I'd like to dissolve the Scottish Parliament, let's have an election. That's not quite how it works in the same way it does for the House of Commons. But for me, the real question might be, we'd need to be careful. I'm not sure that the people of Scotland would entirely welcome that approach. And at the end of the day, if we're going to win independence, we need to take the people of Scotland with us. So we know there's an election this year. That's an electoral opportunity that's coming up, and that's the one we should focus on.
Well, you say that, but the reality is that according to this opinion poll, nearly 6 in 10 Scots would say if that power was vested at Holyrood, they would support that. Only 22% strongly disagreed with that. So you have the support of the Scottish people already.
Yeah, but I think that, with respect to, I think that's a slightly different question from saying, should we have an early Holyrood election? That comes with a lot of caveats and questions.
Yeah.
Would that be something that people of Scotland overall would welcome? I'm not entirely convinced. However, circumstances change, events arise. We need to obviously be responsive to them. But right now, the one election we do know that's going to come sooner rather than later is the Westminster one, and that's the one we have to be prepared for.
I think some people's worries about the Westminster election is that according to the opinion polls, and what other measure do you have right now, the SNP will likely lose seats. So in other words, the Westminster establishment would then point to that and say, look, you're losing support. Right? The SNP could no doubt point to a whole range of opinion polls showing that independence is running at 50-odd%, and therefore that gives them mandate, as it were. But I think that would be countered by the Westminster parties and saying, no, you don't have it. You just don't have it, which means that we would then be in a position of waiting until there is some sort of hung parliament in Westminster in order to exercise any leverage over what happens in Scotland in terms of getting a referendum or a plebiscite of any kind.
Well, there's no denying, we can look at the opinion polls right now, and they are challenging in the context of the elections we've had recently. What I would say, of course, is we head into this election, I think we head into it with confidence. I'm not predicating the SNP contesting this election on the basis of saying, well, that's the opinion polls right now, and that's going to be the outcome of the election. I think there's a lot of road to be travelled, and I think we can perform well at this election, setting out a very clear and strong independence message, and that's what we've resolved that we will do in our manifesto. And I think we can secure support from the people of Scotland for that proposition.
We've had a question about the next election coming up. It's from, I think he's in the Black Isle. He says, when are SNP branches going to be in receipt of the SNP 2024 general election strategy? The party membership agreed that independence would be front, left and centre going forward. How does the minister see this key party decision materialising into a robust strategy? That's from Dan Wood of the Kirramuir and Dean branch.
Well, look, we're obviously at the stage of setting out our stall. The First Minister launched the campaign just last week and set out some of what we say. That's not the entirety of what we say. And we have resolved, every election we've contested, of course, it's been on the basis of advancing Scotland towards independence. But I can't remember a manifesto where we've said we'll be as explicit about it as line 1, page 1 of our manifesto saying a vote for SNP is a vote for Scotland to become an independent country. So we need to make that manifesto resolution come to life, and that will be essential as part of the core message we take forward in the campaign. Now, I'm out and about, I'm campaigning already, and if there's one key message I would be relaying to SNP members and SNP activists is, don't pretend that the general election campaign hasn't started yet. It's underway now. Get out there, be speaking to people, be pressing the independence message. And yes, of course, as we move forward, we need to make sure that we distill that and crystallise that into a message that resonates with people, and I'm confident we can do that.
So just to focus on the question, when will SNP branches be in receipt of the general election strategy, which you say has kicked off? The process has started. Do you know when you'll get their election strategy?
But it depends what you mean by their election strategy. I mean,
well,
those
been material. When are SNP branches going to be in receipt of the SNP 2024 general election strategy?
Well, I mean, with respect, I suppose they're already in receipt of the overall terms of it, because we had that debate back on October at our national conference. And
can I ask you a question?
our strategy would be, now the question is, How do we bring that to life in terms of messaging?
Well,
that process has started, and we'll continue to roll that out over the coming weeks and months.
That takes me neatly on to a question that's cropped up again and again in the emails we had ahead of time. It's about people feeling that the SNP is disadvantaged. Their point is that they say, and I'm paraphrasing now, so what's happened to the rebuttal unit? The First Minister said he'd be right on it way back when. And we've watched Professor Jason Leach, and I mentioned Professor Sundar tonight as well, who've been traduced. I mean, these were pillars of rectitude during a mess. The First Minister then, many people think, did an outstanding job. And these people were mainstays of that approach. And, people are looking at the publicity, the coverage, and they're saying, where's the SNP's rebuttal unit? Why don't people get out there and say, look, this is scandalous. These are professionals. I mean, as Professor Sundar pointed out tonight, it's very hard for me to convince my people to step forward as health experts if this is the sort of treatment we're going to be exposed to. In other words, political considerations are placed ahead of health considerations. And they're saying, and people are saying, well, we could fix that. We have a rebuttal unit. It should be out there. It should be putting these points to. They're saying, where is it? Where is it?
Well, on the wider issues that you've pointed to, and I understand why, because they've been the issues in the last few days. I need to be careful what I say, because of course there's a public inquiry ongoing, and we want to step across that. Safe to say, I agree with the perspective you articulated. The former First Minister, I thought Nicola Sturgeon did an outstanding job steering the country through very difficult times, and we relied on expert advice of the type that you've laid out. And it is concerning if such experts are saying, well, they would have to think twice about stepping forward in the future if we found ourselves in the same unfortunate set of circumstances. So that is of fundamental concern. But in terms of the core question, I suppose the first point I would make is actually there is that unit is now effectively established at headquarters. It is undertaking activity, is undertaking the work. With the best will in the world, though, it's not going to be possible for that unit to rebut every single accusation that's made about every single thing that either the SNP has done or hasn't done, or the Scottish Government has or hasn't done. It's not going to be possible. So it is there, it is doing its work, and I suppose what I would urge is SNP members, SNP supporters to tune into that and actually take some of that information and utilise it themselves. The best way to rebut some of the nonsense that you'll hear on social media in particular is the individual rebutting it themselves rather than the party doing it. So the party can provide the information, and people must take that and use it themselves.
I mean, this is a question which cropped up in a couple of emails, people saying the UK government is now talking seriously about call-up. They're talking about mobilisation. Would the Scottish Government be content to see Scots being dragooned into the forces to fight in the Middle East?
Well, look, we've always been very clear that is not our perspective. We don't believe that people should be compelled to join the armed forces. So I've seen stuff said and reported over the last few days. I don't know how serious a debate that is at this stage, but we've been consistent in our perspective that we don't believe conscription should be part of our society. And if that was to emerge as a serious proposition, then of course we'd need to make sure our voice was heard as part of that debate.
But it could be the case that, as happens in many other instances, the Westminster government says, well, we're really not interested in what you have to say, frankly. As far as we're concerned, dare I say it, sovereignty is vested with us. We've made the decision. You've MPs down here, we listened to them. We decided we didn't like what they had to say, and we're pressing ahead anyway. And you might have...
Well, again, that brings it back to the constitutional question, that as an area that is reserved, and ultimately that could be a potential outcome. But let's be careful about speculating about something that may or may not emerge. This seems to me to be sort of kicking about as a debate in terms of the media or some fringes of the media. If it emerges as a serious proposition, then we'll need to deal with it at that time.
Wouldn't it strengthen? I mean, I don't get any sense in Scotland that young men and women are rushing to the ranks in the light of what's happening in the Middle East. Quite the reverse. Wouldn't it strengthen the SNP to come out right now and say, "You look, we want no part of this. Whatever you're contemplating, it's got nothing to do with what we in Scotland would wish."
Well, I think we need to see if there was serious contemplation of this. I've seen some voices articulating this perspective. I'm not here to defend the UK government, of course. I've not actually seen the UK government advance it as a serious proposition yet. But our perspective is
moving
clear.
along, Jamie, if we may. Sorry, we need to pack a lot of stuff in this evening. Your responsibilities are independent strategy, parliamentary coordination and liaison regarding devolution independence and Scotland's constitutional future. And your third responsibility is communication with people, businesses and organisations regarding devolution independence and Scotland's constitutional future. In that regard, we've had an email from Mark McNaught, who said, "Could you please ask the Minister the following? I know it's lengthy, but detail is important," he says. This is for my guidance, not for yours.
Okay.
It says, SNP policy is to rejoin the European Union as soon as possible after independence, which is understandable given Scottish support for EU membership. However, EU accession could easily take 10 years and be blocked by any uncooperative state at any stage in the process. Also, we do not know what direction the EU will be going in when Scotland might conceivably join, which may not be all that positive. I've been in touch, he says, with the European Free Trade Association and attended a seminar in Brussels last September over EFTA and European Economic Area or Single Market. He says he cannot speak officially on their behalf, but they indicated if the pro-Indy party agreed to unite and demonstrate a majority support for independence in a democratic event, the Westminster or HR plebiscite, Scottish EEA membership, the EFTA would recognise that, and Scotland could join within weeks.
Well, look, we've set out what our position is, and incidentally, it's not just because that's where, although it is the case, that's where public opinion is. We don't need to make the point that people of Scotland overwhelmingly rejected the concept of Brexit across every single local authority area. But it's not just because of that, it's because the SNP, the Scottish Government, fundamentally believe that it's in Scotland's best interest to be part of the European Union. If you look at the OBR projection, there's saying over the longer term there's going to be a 4% cut, reduction to the UK economy in the longer term. Why would we want to be part of that mess? So our perspective is clear, and independent Scotland should seek to rejoin the European Union. Now, how long may that take? Well, none of us can give a definitive answer. Frankly, I don't think it needs to be an overly complicated, difficult process. We're not seeking to be UK 2.0. We're not looking for lots of opt-outs here or there and everywhere in terms of accession criteria. We have had over 4 decades experience of being part of the European Union and its forerunner entities. We're known as being a good actor in European affairs. So I don't think it needs to be a complicated, difficult, drawn-out process. But here's the short answer to those who say, it could be a really long process. Well, it's going to be a lot quicker as a process than as remaining part of the United Kingdom, which shows no intention in terms of looking to rejoin the EU. Yeah. Now, what might be the pathway? Well, let's wait and see. We're aware there are obviously other means and avenues to be part of the European Economic Area, but frankly, we're going to advance our proposition, which is that independent Scotland should be part of the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, it would make sense to have an accompanying strategy in place, which would say, look, particularly bearing in mind that any state, any member state could put the kibosh on this. Nothing to do with the accession process, just except in that sense. Dare I say, I know Spain has said otherwise, but who knows? There might be somebody out there who says, look, I have a problem with this because maybe the UK government have been in touch. They don't have any sort of veto, but they might, through trade and other mechanisms, require somebody to say, look, let's put a bar on this. And what these people are suggesting, Mark McNaught is suggesting, why not speak with EFTA and work out a deal with them? And then you've got a backup position, which could actually end up with Scotland joining the EU anyway, but you at least have got an interim position.
Well, look, on the specifics of the hypothetical circumstances that you've laid out. I mean, of course, you're correct to say the process of joining the EU requires the consent of every member state, and hypothetically, that means one member could say, no, we're not having that. I don't see those circumstances likely to arise. Scotland is a democratic, free society. It has been part of the European Union. I think people recognise that. Incidentally, we bring a lot of strengths to the European Union in terms of our strategic position in the North Atlantic, in terms of the energy resource that we have, in terms of the abundance of resource that we can bring. So I don't think it's a serious proposition, and certainly the notion that the UK could have a quiet word with someone and surreptitiously say, could you please veto this, I don't think it's a serious one, because I don't think the UK has much purchase with the European Union or any of its member states much these days.
I suspect you're right. Nonetheless, there is a reasonable point in here, it seems to me, that it's always useful to have a backup position should you get into any negotiation.
I understand that. I suppose the point I'm making is, we've set out where we want Scotland to get to, and that's where we want to end up. The path to it. Okay. But let's see where we have to tread. But
would you
we
be
know
willing
where the destination is, and that's what we're going to articulate.
Would you be willing, since part of your responsibility is to have communication with people, businesses, and organisations, would you be willing to have a chat with someone like Mark McNaught about EFTA and the possibility?
Look, my door's open. If people contact me and
there you are, Mark.
Then I'm more than willing to give consideration to that proposition.
You've proved that tonight. Thank you very much. A good friend of mine in the SNP is Ian Blackford, and I was somewhat taken aback, along with others.
I know where this is going.
His recent remarks about the House of Lords. Has the SNP any intention of modifying its policy on occupying a seat in the House of Lords?
Well, let's deal with that point first. No is the long answer short. I think, to be fair to Ian, I've not seen the full context, but I've seen some coverage that suggests there might be a wee bit of mischief in terms of the presentation of what Ian precisely said. And I know Ian, and he's a good friend as well. But certainly, I don't think the prospect of the SNP changing its stance on whether or not we should be sending members to the other place is likely to change anytime soon.
Yeah.
Not if I've got anything to do with it anyway, that's for sure.
What's your view on talking about House of Lords and associated things? What's your view on an independent Scotland being a republic?
Look, my own personal view is, and I've not hidden it, I believe that an independent Scotland should be a republic. Now, what we've laid out as part of our paper, the government paper on a written constitution for an independent Scotland, is that the monarchy should remain the head of state for so long as the people of Scotland want it. So effectively, going back to that point of sovereignty, if the people of Scotland desire a different path, then that's for them to determine freely at the ballot box. So, my own personal position is pretty clear. Also, the First Minister has said the same as well. But the government's position is such that this is a question that, frankly, it can be determined once we're independent.
Julie Brown is asking, would there be a referendum on joining the EU?
Again, I don't think there needs to be. This obviously would be something that would be determined post-independence. So again, it would be determined at the ballot box. So a range of parties will stand. They'll stand on different propositions. Some may stand, well, a vote for us is a vote to endorse the proposition that Scotland should rejoin the EU. Others may stand on the basis that there should be a referendum. So I don't think there has to be one, but yes, it's possible there could be one. Yeah.
I mean, there's an issue that's out there which has been bubbling along for some time, Jamie, which is about this election might be seen, as you say, as affirmation or confirmation that the Scottish Government should start negotiations if there's a majority. But there's already been periods where there's been a majority of MPs and negotiations haven't started. So why would they, and what principle is there, what has changed since that time and now? Why is now different to what happened before?
There's two things I would say in respect to that, John. First of all, it kind of goes back to the point I made earlier. We're probably more explicit than we have been in the past in terms of the pathway. The second point I make is we can't predicate our position on what others may or may not do. Now, of course, that has a practical impact on where we will move next, how we'll take forward the independence platform and how we'll advance to becoming independent. But we cannot and we must not predicate our own position on ifs and ands and maybes and buts. So all we can do is control our own campaign, our own message. We've said out what that will be. We'll seek endorsement from the people of Scotland. And then once we've got that endorsement, we will be knocking on the door looking to take that forward.
I think the notion is that you've already had that endorsement. I mean, I'm trying to think of other circumstances in other countries where a majority of the legislators from that country has been in the majority, and that has not been taken as a mandate. I mean, regardless of what was said during an election, people surely knew when they were voting SNP that they were not voting for devolution, they were voting for independence. I mean, that's the reality.
Well, I certainly would I think most people know when they vote for the SNP, they're voting for a party that believes in independence.
Really?
And we're going to be pretty explicit about that in the manifesto we present. I mean, what has changed is that we're now heading into another election, and all we can do is lay out our platform and seek endorsement for that, and then try and put that into effect thereafter.
But isn't there a danger, Jamie, that if you do exactly as you propose, as the party proposes, and the outcome is, and I know you don't want to speculate, but people are anxious on this point.
Of course. Yeah.
If the outcome is a reduced or a greatly reduced number of SNP MPs, then by virtue of the very fact that you predicated your stance on independence would allow the opponents to say, well, there you are. When they actually put it to people, people said no. So you've actually gone back.
Our opponents will say and do what our opponents will say and do. I suppose it speaks to the fundamental point that we need to be out there, we need to be campaigning, we need to make sure that we win the case for independence. Now, we should be entering this election confident in our ability to do that, confident in the independence case. That's the basis on which I will be campaigning, and that's the basis on which I'll be seeking support and endorsement for the SNP. And, that's all we can do at this stage.
I understand nobody wants to give a hostage to fortune. You don't want to say anything such as, oh, well, it sort of depends, because then it just sounds lame and the opposition take advantage of that. But at the same time, it seems to me there's a need. For example, if here's another example of the sovereignty versus the sovereignty. There's talk now Westminster is going to tighten up the civil service rules in terms of the freedom that Scottish Government has to discuss devolution, all the areas that you're responsible for. Mm-hmm. They're now saying, well, we don't like that, and we're going to try and reduce that work. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, that's just outrageous. What is your take on that, if it's true?
Well, it's only been talk so far, and frankly, it's been talk from a few sources. So, the preeminent person that's been talking about this, and there's no little irony lost on me in the sense that it's an unelected member of the House of Lords saying that a democratic elected government shouldn't be able to speak about wants to speak about having got the endorsement of the people of Scotland. George Fawkes seems to be the person that's running with this. We've got the mandate. I'm working with civil servants right now. They are, and I've been able to rely on the professionalism of the civil service in Scotland in any ministerial role that I've undertaken, responding to the agenda that the democratically elected government of the day has. And, I'm able to rely on that right now. So, I'm going to keep on working on that basis, and I don't see anything that's going to step across that anytime soon.
I think the reason it causes concern is not about any crimp on the civil servants you work with, really, because people are not au fait with what happens in government. Maybe if they did, they'd be a bit more compassionate about politicians. but
Not so sure about that, John.
Well, everyone seems to think being a politician is a piece of cake, and you must come across that all the time, Jamie. But the reality is that because sovereignty, as you said earlier, the sovereignty that you have to work with is a sovereignty imposed by Westminster. It does mean that at any time, for example, the Westminster government could abolish Holyrood.
Well, indeed, the Scottish Parliament is a creature of statute. We don't have a written codified constitution in the United Kingdom, a complete outlier, one of a tiny handful of states that doesn't have a written constitution that sets out and specifies that there should be a Scottish Parliament, or dare I say it, the Senate or the Northern Ireland Assembly. These things are not set out and protected in a written constitution. So hypothetically, then yes, Westminster could vote to abolish the Scottish Parliament. Now, are the politics such that they're likely to do that? I'm not so sure. But yes, at least on a hypothetical basis, they could possibly do so. One of the reasons, of course, why I think it'd be rather better that we had an independent Scottish Parliament than a devolved Scottish Parliament.
Well, I think many people watching tonight would agree with that. One issue that cropped up during the last week, I don't know if you became aware of it, but an MP from Northern Ireland is planning to stand for the European Parliament.
I have missed this. I have missed this news entirely, I'm afraid, John. I've been busy away in my ministerial role.
Well, you see, apparently there's a Sinn Féin member from Northern Ireland is standing for the European Parliament. And the first question I had, and I was hoping you might be able to answer it, but you can't if you haven't come across it, I suspect, is under what piece of legislation is that possible? Is that because the Northern Ireland arrangements are fluid, or is it because the EU and the UK have joint responsibility for Northern Ireland that this is a possibility?
Well, without having seen the full details, I'm dangerously going into idle speculation here, but I would idly speculate that this individual may be seeking to be elected from the Republic of Ireland. Clearly,
well, that's what I thought at
Ireland
first.
can benefit by both Irish citizenship and
if
it is perceived to be a benefit.
It might be worth checking out, because the first time I came across it, I thought, well, that's just not possible, because you can't be an MP and be part of the EU Parliament. But then that question was answered, because she then said, and I read the piece that said, of course, I will stand down from Westminster. Not that she actually attends Westminster, but
Indeed,
from the formal position.
Probably a bit of a moot point in terms of the practicalities, but I suspect this person will be standing in the Republic rather than anywhere else.
Who knows? But the fact of the matter is, what she's saying is that, effectively, Northern Ireland, if this were true, would have a representative in the EU. I can't quite figure out the constitutional implication of that, but it would be, let's put it this way, it would be interesting. You're working with different groups, Jamie. We've had a note from Mariana Clyde, and she said, would the Minister consider further meetings with the Scottish Currency Group about their ideas for setting up a central bank and a Scottish currency ASAP after independence, and not when the time is right? She makes the point that the business world hates uncertainty. This is certainly true.
Yeah.
As a business
I appreciate that latter point. I understand the sentiment in which the question was asked, but I'm not going to agree with the proposition that we should launch it as soon as possible and not when the time is right. If we're launching it as soon as possible, it's because the time is right to do so.
Right.
I've met with the representatives of the Scottish Currency Group. We had a really useful discussion, more than open to doing so again. Frankly, I don't, there's maybe could be perceived to be an inch between of difference between what we've laid out and that perspective rather than a mile. We've not been prescriptive in terms of a timescale at which we would launch an independent Scottish currency. I think the key thing, I think it's the right thing to say, how could it be anything other than the right thing to say, well, you would do it at the optimal point in time when it is felt to be in the best interest of the people of Scotland and the Scottish economy.
It could be ASAP.
Theoretically, yes, it could be. The key thing, of course, would be that we'd need to be ready to do it. And what we have said is we would use the period between which we've decided to become independent, transitioning to being independent, to make sure that we have the relevant institutions to enable us to have a currency, a central bank being the most obvious example, but a debt management agency as well, a regulator for the banking financial services sector. These are things that we would need to put in place.
Is it the case that the EU requires any candidate country to have its own currency?
Well, I think there's some debate about that. So, some people might say yay, other people might say nay. But at the end of the day, we've laid out our intention to have an independent Scottish currency, and we have said that it would be closely tied to the process of us seeking to become an EU state. So, it's probably a bit of a moot point as to whether it's necessary. We are effectively saying that's the process we would follow.
Yeah, but you're not ruling out entirely the idea of a central bank and a Scottish currency as soon as it's practicable, I guess.
Well, indeed, it would have to be practicable, I suppose, would be the first point. I think it's the sensible thing for us to say. I think it's fundamentally the essential thing to say is we do it at the optimal point. You can go fast, you can go slow, or you can go smart. Well, I would go smart.
Jamie, you've had dealings with civil servants and I assume ministers in Westminster. Mm-hmm. And if there were to be any negotiations, and I'm thinking about the Indian model, I'm thinking about way back to 1776 and the American model, there's been an accepted way that the Foreign Office was then approached these things. It was all about negotiation. And do you get any sense that there's an understanding of any kind, or would you expect the negotiations to be straightforward? Or as some people, I think, watching tonight would think, no, I think it's going to be quite complicated.
Well, I'm not going to sit here. No one would believe me if I was to say, it's going to be entirely straightforward. We've voted for independence, and we're independent tomorrow. Of course, there have to be a process of negotiation. If the fundamental question is, are we equipped and ready and able to do that? Then yes, is again long answer short. We're laying out. We've published now 9 prospectus papers for an independent Scotland through the Building a New Scotland series of prospectus papers. There's more to come. So we're laying out very clearly our thinking in these areas. And of course, as part of that, we think, well, how would we actually go into negotiations with the UK government to actually put these things into practical effect?
Now you're not a cabinet member, are you?
No.
What is your reporting line, Jamie, within the Scottish government?
I'm report directly to the First Minister.
Oh, right. Okay. Would you perhaps be kind enough to mention to him that we'd love to have him on the show?
I'm sure he's watching right now, John. I'll pass that on.
We'd appreciate that, right? Because Stephen Flynn is joining us next month from Westminster. And so many people have been hugely impressed by his performance on the floor, because it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, I know people watching it on television think it's so easy. You just stand up there and you just sort of, out it comes. And it's not a bit like that. You've got this baying mass of people behind you and ahead of you, and you have to put up with all of that nonsense. Now, I know you get your fair share of that in the Scottish Parliament, but it tends to be a good deal more orderly, it seems to me, than exists at Westminster. My experience of being at Westminster was...
I'll let the presiding officer say whether or not she perceives that to be the case. I think you're fundamentally correct in that, John. And I think Stephen's doing a great job down there. We've been lucky to have had effective people in that role for some time. I thought Ian did a great job before Stephen, and of course Angus before Ian. So, we've got a litany, a line of people that have been doing a job. But yeah, I think Stephen's doing a fantastic job down there. And I'll pass on the message to the First Minister.
Please, if you wouldn't mind, we'd love to have him on. And we've just had so many questions tonight, and I suspect we'd probably have even more. Here's one from Charles Muggleston. He said, "Good evening, Minister. Please can you tell us, when Scotland achieves independence, will it legislate that the Stone of Scone will never be used at an English coronation again?" There you are. Easiest question tonight.
Do you know, I don't know if it is the easiest question, John. Look, we've not said anything about that in terms of our prospectus paper, so I'll give it some consideration. But
I think you need to, because obviously Charles is concerned, and there may be other folks out there who feel, hey, this is a cultural thing, and it's important to us.
I think national symbols and national emblems are important. They're not going to be the first thing that people think about and are concerned about when we enter the debate over Scotland's future, of course. But yeah, of course they're important, and our heritage, our history, our culture is something that we should value. So I understand where the question's coming from. I've already professed my own preference in terms of the constitutional order of things, but in line with what we've laid out in our prospectus paper, perhaps for so long as the people of Scotland desire the retention of the monarchy, then we'll keep it up here, and they'll have to come up here and send it to be crowned the King or Queen of Scots.
Well, that would certainly boost the tourism business, I imagine. I know you're well read and you study history, but there's an interesting parallel here between what's happening in this year as far as the Westminster elections and what happened at the beginning of the 20th century with the Irish parliamentary group, which was sometimes 80 strong, maybe more. And yet, when it actually came down to agreeing a way forward, Westminster proved to be intractable. And then what happened was that group fell apart and was replaced by Sinn Féin and others. Isn't there a danger if people feel that the independence, i.e. the independence process is moving forward? The polls confirm this time and time again, 50-50. But the SNP support has dropped. So isn't there a real danger the SNP could find itself in the same position as the Irish parliamentary group way back at the beginning of the 20th century?
Well, you're right, I did study history, and I can't profess to have been an expert in this area of history, but of course the Irish Parliamentary Party, it wasn't an independence supporting party, it was a devolutionist party, and of course the SNP is the party of independence. So there's the first difference I would proffer in terms of the analogy. But I understand the question, but for me, the fundamental thing is Scotland only advances constitutionally, even short of independence. We wouldn't have a Scottish Parliament, we wouldn't have devolution, I believe, without the SNP, and we won't achieve independence without the SNP performing well. So, so long as we continue to hold true to our position, and we're going to do that, and we're going to continue to advocate for and seek to advance Scotland towards independence, then I hope and trust that the people of Scotland will remain with us. That doesn't come for granted. I would never take that for granted. Of course, we have to make sure that we're out there making the case, delivering for people, and that's exactly what I'll focus on doing.
In terms of making the case, last week's guest has been in touch, Eva Cromie, saying, look, she would love to participate in a three-way process with she and you and on the TNT show. How do you feel about that?
Well, you send me the invite and we'll see what the diary looks like.
Okay, there you are, Eva. I said I'd ask the question and I did. I, of course, the SNP is not a devolutionary party, but when you run a devolved assembly, a devolved parliament, there is a danger that along the way, that's actually what happens. You become, as it were, I'm not talking about you personally, I'm talking about the entity becomes comfortable with that status, i.e. that we've gained some traction, we need to work with that traction, but somehow at the same time you need to keep pace with the actual members of the independence movement who understandably want everything to happen much, much quicker and are concerned that the SNP has become complacent and is comfortable with devolution, likes being government ministers, likes the Ford Mondays or whatever companies are, and are happy with that.
I'm going to let you into a secret, John. I would like it to happen quicker too. You know, the frustration that is felt by people out there who want Scotland to become independent is also felt by those of us who have the privilege, and it is a privilege, to be an elected representative who are also seeking to advance Scotland towards independence. I'm frustrated we're not there. I joined the SNP when I was 18 years old. I would have loved Scotland to become independent the day after I joined the SNP. Now, that's not come to fruition. We still find ourselves fighting the fight, and I can quite assure you, I don't get any sense from those of my colleagues who've been elected here, many of whom, I mentioned I've been doing this since I was 18. That's about slightly over a quarter of a century ago, giving away a bit of a secret there. There's some of my colleagues who've been doing this even longer than I have. We joined the SNP to win independence. That's what we're in it for, and that's what we're going to keep campaigning for.
Yeah. Well, you're preaching to the choir. I joined 60 years ago. I no longer remember, by the way. But
you'd be welcome to come back anytime, John.
I've been pushing this boulder up the hill like Sisyphus for all these years. But I want to task you on one thing. We've passed over it fairly quickly, but I think it's important, Jamie. This councillor who wrote saying, look, I think, and my apologies, by the way, if you're watching tonight, for some reason, the system did not run off your name. It just said councillor, and it quoted this. It says...
Well, maybe that's what they wanted, John. That could be part of this councillor.
Or maybe I'm being discreet, maybe one of the two. So his first point was, and it's a fairly interesting point, and I think would interest a lot of people watching and listening tonight, the SNP to hold talks with leaders of all pro-independence parties and movements. Would you agree with that?
At the juncture that it's appropriate to do so, potentially yes. But right now we're in an electoral contest. We're standing as the SNP, and that doesn't come without some of its challenges and tensions. I recognise that. We're in government with another pro-independence party right now, and there'll probably be candidates of both parties standing against one another. That's just the reality. That's the nature of electoral politics. My own perspective is, and it's a very clear one, and I think the facts bear it out, that actually the best chance to ensure we have pro-independence parliamentarians returned is them standing on an SNP ticket, because it goes back to the fundamental point you made. People understand and know that the SNP is a party of independence. So, but of course, when the time is appropriate, we should be willing and open to have these conversations.
So if there was a strategy that said SNP 1 and some other party number 2, you'd be comfortable with that?
Look, we'd need to obviously go through the process of considering that as a party. But right now we're going into an electoral contest where that's not the system. The system is people will be voting in the first past the post system to return a member to single member constituency. So that's the proposition before us. What we may do at subsequent elections is something we need to consider down the line.
Yeah. You've no doubt been down to Westminster on occasion.
I have. Thankfully not too frequently.
What is your reaction? What do you think of the place? I'm going to ask the same question of Stephen, by the way. But so, how do you feel when you go in there in these hallowed halls?
Well, you already made the point. I was a student of history, so as a student of history, it is not without its interesting facets. But the place could be doing with a bit of a carpet shampoo, if I could put it that way. It's seen better days. Look, it's not a place I would aspire to be down regularly. And thankfully, those are my colleagues who've been elected down there. They don't aspire to be down there for any longer than they need to either. They're down there to do a job of business, to make the case, to represent their constituents. Then we end independence, and they come back up the road and help us build a better society here in Scotland.
We've talked a lot tonight about different aspects of the independence process. And I think that's been your fundamental view, which is that it is a process. It's not as it were, a one-off. You have to sort of work towards it. You have to establish a base. You have to establish confidence in that base. But doesn't that take you to another issue, which is that because of the pernicious nature of the Scottish media, the very fact that you've established that base becomes a cudgel to strike you around the head, i.e., look at the mess they're making of Scotland and think how bad it would be if they became independent. That's the basic line that the media...
Well, of course, people who are opposed to independence will trot out that line. They'll trot out a whole host of lines, that goes back to the fundamental point. We need to make the case. You're right, we have talked about process quite a lot, and you're right also, we need to go through a process to become independent. But actually, when push comes to shove, the way we'll win independence is by persuading the people of Scotland, and the way we persuade the people of Scotland is probably not talking so much about process, but actually getting out there and making the case as to why independence would enable us to create a better society here in Scotland. So, that's fundamentally at the core of the work I'm doing through the Building a New Scotland series of prospectus papers. The first one is predicated on looking at the countries around us, countries of a population of about 5 million in north of Europe, Finland, Ireland, Norway, Denmark, all more prosperous countries, all healthier countries, all fairer countries, all happier countries than the UK. We should be out there talking about that. We should be out there making the case that these are countries we should aspire to be like, and it's only through independence that we can actually achieve that.
Well, something, it's not just the small countries. I've got some experience of Iberia, and even though Portugal is a poor country in many respects, certainly compared to Scotland, somehow things seem to work better. And the same for Spain, because they haven't gone through Thatcher. So there isn't a ready acceptance that everyone who gets benefits is a scrounger. And that's because they don't have the same, dare I say it, pernicious media that victimizes people who are in any way needing benefits or support in any way, where support is seen to be some sort of concession. This is the basic reality of it. So there tends to be a general view across Europe, which is that the UK is headed off in a particularly and very strange direction. And I think maybe that's what drives the independence movement, maybe more than anything else. Look, we've covered a lot of bases tonight. Thank you very much for that, Jamie. Is there anything you would like to say to the folks out there in closing?
Well, look, the main thing I would say is, stick with us. We're in the face of a behemoth, a machine in terms of the British state. We know that they'll throw everything at us, but we know that our case is a good one, is a strong one, and the way we win it is by being out there, speaking to those who are yet to be persuaded. And that's what I'm going to be doing between now and, well, I was going to say the next election, but I'll be doing it between now and us winning the case and winning independence.
When do you think the next election will be? November?
I think, I don't always take things from the Prime Minister at face value, but I think probably we are able to take at face value it's going to be an autumn election. So having said that, we can now probably prepare for a spring one.
Jamie, thank you very much. And thank you for offering to speak to the First Minister. And thank you for your comments about perhaps Eva coming in a joint discussion. That's very helpful. Are much appreciated. We seek to engage, enlighten and educate, and you've done all of that for us tonight. Much appreciated. Thank you very much. If you could stick around after we go off air, that would be very helpful. Thank you again. Well, a big thank you to Jamie, and a big thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the show. As ever, we have a formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. I've mentioned Stephen Flynn. We also have a star guest coming up next week. And please, my constant reminder, look out for Dr. Elliot Bulmer's column in the Sunday National. You'll find it in the 7-day supplement. Sadly, after 4 years, this will be the last of his regular columns. He may well be appearing occasionally. So to all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe, take care, and please remember the crowdfunder. Good night, all.